morning and welcome to History Timeline. I'm Amanda Melschling here with Nick Goldbeck, who's in our studio library with our special guest today. On today's edition, we are going to relive the moments that caused U.S. to join Japan in World War II. Today, December 7th, is the anniversary of when Japan attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Last week we talked about the effects of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States and how it ultimately prompted President Franklin D. Roosevelt to address Congress asking for the emergence and declaration of war against Japan in World War II. This week's episode we are going to focus more on the Japanese side of the 1941 Pearl Harbor attacks. With real footage and actual pictures available, Nick brings you the details.
Prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan was establishing itself as a major power in East Asia. Similar to the United States' concept of manifest destiny, Japan saw territorial conquest as imminent. Throughout the early 20th century, Japan aggressively invaded Manchuria, China, and Indochina despite requests from the U.S. to stop. This aggressive behavior ultimately drove the U.S. to withhold oil and steel from Japan, who desperately needed the resources after the worldwide depression in the late 1920s. Japan was left to make a crucial decision: improve diplomatic relations with the U.S. in the hopes of once again obtaining these essential resources, or continue the aggressive behavior and go to war with the United States. Their decision ultimately had devastating effects on the U.S. and changed the face of Japanese military power forever.
What were the Japanese reasons for attacking Pearl Harbor? Who were the intelligent leaders who planned the attack to be so successful? What planning was involved? And to conclude, what really went through the minds of the Japanese? All this and more when we return.
Could switching to Geico really save you 15% or more on car insurance? Did the little piggy cry wee 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 all the way home?
Maxwell!
Yeah?
You're home.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Mrs. A.
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Welcome back, and now to our History Timeline library. Nick is with Pearl Harbor historian Sarah.
When did planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor start?
Early in 1941, Japanese naval aviation experts concluded that an attack of that magnitude would be possible, but the final decision wasn't made until September 6th. The plan was fully completed by the end of October, and the senior commanders were given a complete briefing on November 2nd. 5 days later, Admiral Yamamoto named December 8th as the date of the attack.
How did the Japanese train for the attack?
Extensive training was crammed into the few weeks preceding the attack. Japanese Imperial Navy practiced low-level torpedo bombing in Yokoshima Bay because it resembled the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Successful results were achieved a mere 3 weeks before the attack was scheduled to take place, and the specially manufactured torpedoes didn't even arrive until 2 days before the fleet set sail for Hawaii on November 26th.
What was the plan of attack for Pearl Harbor?
6 aircraft carriers left for Pearl Harbor on November 26th and took an extra long northern route in order to avoid detection for as long as possible. The attack was split into 2 waves. The goal of the first wave was for 360 aircraft to attack the highest value targets like battleships and aircraft carriers, and to destroy as many parked aircraft as possible to prevent Americans from getting into the air to combat the Japanese. The second wave consisted of remaining aircraft as well as 48 defensive combat air patrol planes, aiming to destroy anything that would have been left behind in the first wave. Japanese junior officers, including Mitsuo Fuchida, urged the higher officers to carry out a proposed third wave, which aimed at destroying torpedo storage, maintenance, and dry dock facilities, which would have crippled the American fleets significantly more than the first two waves alone. However, after the heavy losses suffered in the second wave due to increasing American defenses, the third wave was never carried out.
Who were the major decision makers?
Emilio Yamamoto was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet during World War II. Ironically enough, Yamamoto was a student at Harvard University from 1919 until 1921. He was one who had planned the attack and came up with the structure of the whole operation, including the organization of the two waves of attack. Politically, Yamamoto's decision ultimately caused his death. On April 17, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighter planes shot down a Mitsubishi bomber containing Yamamoto under orders from Franklin D. Roosevelt. His body was found the next day.
As you can see, the Japanese were meticulous in their planning of the attack, but what led them to decide to go through with such a dangerous mission? Dr. Matt Borzamowski from Columbia University is here to tell us about what was going through their heads. What were the events leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Japan was attempting to establish itself as a major power in the East. In the 1930s, they had already invaded many of Germany's colonies in the Far East, and they withdrew from the League of Nations and invaded countries like China and Manchuria in an effort to expand. At this time, the United States, despite their superior naval force, was trying to keep themselves out of the war, while trying to attempt and maintain world diplomacy.
Why did Japan feel the need to attack the United States?
The United States were keen on ending Japanese expansion. After attempts at restoring diplomacy didn't work, President Roosevelt banned all exports of steel, oil, and other resources to Japan. Japan got 80% of their oil supply from the United States, so this embargo was a devastating blow to the Japanese economy. Japan got revenge by targeting the United States Pacific Fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor. At this time, America had the strongest naval fleet in the world. Japan felt that by destroying the fleet, the United States would be disheartened and the cracks would arise in American society, threatening its stability.
Did differing beliefs in the East and West contribute to the attack?
Well, Japan saw themselves as a superior people to the Americans. They believed that they had a right to expand their power and ultimately rule as much of the world as they could, which conflicted with the beliefs of the League of Nations and the United States, who were trying to spread diplomacy. When Japan looked at American culture, they saw a diverse mix of races and ethnicities, which concluded that America was incapable of acting as a single, united force. This belief, coupled with the realization that Western powers were hostile towards Japan, caused the Japanese to convince themselves that it was their duty to cripple the United States.
What were the causes and reasons Japan attacked? The answers and details will follow when we return.
Could switching to Geico really save you 15% or more on car insurance? Was Abe Lincoln honest?
Does this dress make my backside look big?
Perhaps it...
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.
Welcome back to History Timeline. To end this segment, we have Nick back in our History Timeline library with a very special guest that we want to welcome to our show. Mitsuo Fuchida is a famous Japanese pilot who recently moved to the U.S. Fuchida not only witnessed but actually participated in the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Today we get his side of the story, his view, and his feelings on the bombings. Nick?
So you led the first wave of attack?
Yeah.
What happened that morning?
We took off at 0600 hours to fly 275 miles to Oahu. During the 2-hour plane ride, so many thoughts were going through my head. My actions would be responsible for the rise and fall of the Japanese Empire. It's a lot of weight to carry on your shoulders.
Were you scared about the possibility of dying?
I was more concerned with bringing honor to my country. If I died for the benefit of Japan, it would have been an honorable death, but I worried about how my family would cope.
What happened when you reached Oahu?
When we finally reached the north shore of the island, I was anxious to see how many of our main targets were going to be parked in the harbor. I was disappointed to find that none of the aircraft carriers were there. But I focused on the 8 battleships sitting on the water. At 7:49, I ordered the attack command, and 3 minutes later, we were told that we had achieved the element of surprise.
How did this attack start?
The first bomb was dropped on Wheeler Field. At this point, I knew we couldn't turn back. The first sign of resistance was immediately shot down by my team. We started climbing in altitude to begin our battle runs, and the noise was overwhelming.
Did you ever get shot at?
At one point, the plane started bouncing, and we got a radio message saying we'd been hit. But we kept control of the plane. During our second run, there was a huge explosion, which I now know was the USS Arizona blowing up. Finally, we dropped our torpedoes. I ducked down to the bottom of the cockpit to look through to see if we had struck. I had watched as the torpedo got smaller and smaller, and finally I saw 2 puffs of smoke. The run was completed, and the bombers were headed back to our aircraft carrier.
What did you do after the first wave?
I was just relieved that it was over. I stayed to assess the damage and observe the second wave of attacks, and then we all went home. I was proud of what we had accomplished.
Did you feel any guilt for what you did that day?
Mostly I just felt pride and relief. Years later I realized that my actions directly resulted in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I still have trouble dealing with that. I eventually converted to Christianity in an attempt to deal with all the guilt.
The devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was declared a success by Japanese, however, frustrated at the fact they failed to destroy very important machine shops and oil storage areas at Pearl Harbor, still all in all received a greatly unexpected victory at Pearl Harbor. As a result of the victory, Japanese militia leaders became exceedingly overconfident about their militia powers. Because of their actions toward the U.S., the United States had no choice but to enter World War II. This concludes this week's edition of History Timeline. Until next time, I'm Amanda Milchling with Nick Golbeck in the History Timeline Library. Thank you, and remember to live for today because tomorrow is history. You guys.
I did it again.